I'm going to turn the microphone over to our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Martha Morell. Dr. Morell is a luminary in the field and is somebody you're going to hear from a couple of different times today. And she's going to start by really giving us a solid foundation on the RNS system and what we see in the focal epilepsy population. Marty?
Thank you, Joel. I'll begin by telling you that Vikram, Mark, and I are very excited to be able to tell you about the NeuroPace story. And just to share with you how I ended up here, I was an academic neurologist running epilepsy programs when Frank Fisher, our founding CEO, came to me with a wild idea. And that was, since patients spend most of their time not having seizures, why don't we treat them just when they do and where they need it? And that made a lot of sense to me, particularly since I had just come from the room of a patient who we were evaluating for epilepsy surgery. They weren't a candidate, and I realized there was nothing I could do for them. And now I'm in a situation where I can do a lot for my own patients. So I'm going to begin by just talking about epilepsy. So epilepsy is actually not one disorder. It's a group of brain disorders that share in common seizures. And those seizures are unprovoked, they're unpredictable, and they're recurring. I think many people don't realize how common epilepsy is. It's the fourth most common neurological disorder. And what we're talking about that makes so much sense is let's treat a recurrent electrical disturbance with electricity. And we also have an opportunity because there's a substantial number of people with epilepsy that aren't responding to anti-epileptic medications and really don't have other options. So I want you to think about the epilepsies as falling into two broad categories. There's the focal epilepsies, and those are seizures that begin in a focus in the brain and then will often spread. But there's a point, there's a region, there's a network that we can define as being the generator. Those patients, everybody takes anti-seizure medications, and they're also, at this moment in time, candidates for neuromodulation. They also, a very few of them, are candidates for a resective or ablative surgery at a focus in the seizure that is safe to remove. But that is the minority. And the rest of the patients we have really focused on. The other type of epilepsy is generalized epilepsy, and this occurs when there is a discharge that involves the entire brain. The only therapy for these patients is one medication after the other, because in this group, as with focal epilepsy, 30 to 40% do not respond to anti-epileptic medications. We have an international organization called the International League Against Epilepsy that really discusses what the benchmark and what the goal should be. They define drug-resistant epilepsy as failure of two medications that are tolerated, and those medications have not achieved seizure control without life-limiting side effects. This is a different change in practice. It's two medications, and we know that there's less than a 5% chance that you're going to have a substantial response. So what should we be doing? Well, the standard of care, according to the ILAE and our own American Epilepsy Society, is you take two drugs and then you get referred to an epilepsy center for consideration of non-pharmacologic therapies, including neuromodulation and the RNS. But what is the reality? And this is what we have really had to do. We've had to carry this educational effort, and we've done that. But the reality is that patients take one medication after the other, even though there's no expectation that they will achieve benefit. And oftentimes, they've experienced 10 to 20 years of intractable epilepsy before they get to an epilepsy center, or maybe they never do. So the International League Against Epilepsy also partitions epilepsy into those two main categories that I talked about. 60% of the patients have focal onset seizures, those seizures that begin in a focus or region in the brain. And within that group are those who have seizures beginning from one or two regions or foci, those are the patients for whom we have an indication for use. Patients may also have foci that are multiple, and this is a patient population that everyone, physicians and NeuroPace has been thinking about as still amenable to our therapy, but in a more regional sense. The other type of epilepsy is where we're spending a lot of time, and those are that 40% of patients that I mentioned have generalized onset seizures. There's two categories of very different epilepsies within that group. One occurs in otherwise neurologically normal individuals who have epilepsy arising all of the cortex, all of the brain, and most of these individuals are presumed to have a genetic epilepsy disorder. Those are the patients that we are addressing in our Nautilus trial. The other group are individuals who have epilepsy because there's widespread brain injury or problems in development or just dysfunction. Those are the patients that we are looking at for the Lennox-Gastaut study. And we have not forgotten the 15% of patients who are children. And we will talk about that. But the ultimate goal is to have a very simple indication for use. The indication will be for the treatment of epilepsy. Let me talk about the therapy. The basic concept, as I mentioned, is most of the time the brain is fine. So let's have a device that is placed at the seizure focus that's looking at the brain electrical activity all of the time, that recognizes when there is a variation from normal that could predict seizures or is characteristic of pre-seizure activity. Let's provide an intervention, and then let's see if the patient needs any more treatment. How do we do this? We do this with the neuromodulation device that the whole system is self-contained. So it's placed within the skull, excellent signal to noise ratio. Patients can't see it. They can't feel the stimulation. Leads are placed according to the region of interest. And then the device is communicated with by a physician programmer or a remote monitor that the patient takes home. They hold a wand over the device, upload that device, upload information from the device, and all of that is sent to a secure database called the Patient Data Management System, or PDMS. This is a treasure trove. I think about it as the library for every individual patient. All of the device behavior, all of the recordings for each individual is there. So I, with a passport, am able to go into PDMS and open up the library for my patient. What does this mean? Well, I finally know what I'm doing. I can see what's happening. And rather than depend on a seizure diary that is often inaccurate because seizures may occur while patients are asleep, or they may not remember the seizures as part of it, or they just get tired of recording them all. And I can see what's going on and inform my treatment. I can inform my how I address programming of the RNS system, and Vikram will talk later about other impacts this has on clinical care. Before the patient, I can turn that screen around and show them their information. And Mike will talk about what that means, but it's usually a really profound experience, really a moving experience as patients finally see what it is they've been facing. So let me talk about the kind of data that we get. There's a number of data presentations or representations that come from the device, including samples of the intracranial EEG recorded directly from the brain, directly where the problem is. This includes the samples of the intracranial EEG and also a recording of every time a detection has been made, the detection of abnormal activity, and when that has occurred. So we can look at the cadence and the schedule, and Vikram will talk about that. What you see in the panel to the right is an electrographic seizure, where you see the blue recorded directly from the brain. And what you see in the lower panel is the record of every one of those detections. I can look at that hours over the day, days over the week, weeks, months, and even years. And that really allows me to see objectively how my patient is doing. So that data is used so that I can be a much smarter physician. I can address interventions according to this data that I see, and I am able to monitor really almost in real time, how my interventions have affected the patient. So what do we have here? Well, there is no other therapy like the RNS system that really lets you know about the educational effort we needed to do from the beginning. And we have, as you will hear, a extraordinarily solid database that demonstrates effectiveness and safety in rigorous clinical trials. We have a device that can provide individualized care. It can be personalized to that patient's seizure signature, and it can be modified. It can be modified to do what the patient needs. It is non-destructive. We are not destroying brain. We are not taking it away. And it is also, it does not preclude other options. We can continue to treat the patient with the other tools that are available. I talked to you about the therapy and the data, but I didn't talk to you about the flexibility. In our clinical trials, we have experience treating patients in every region of the cerebral cortex, including in the hippocampus at the temporal lobe, which is often an origin for seizures. And now we have increasing experience with treating patients in the thalamus. We are also able to be flexible in what is detected and also how stimulation is delivered. The trials. We began with the first patient implanted in 2004 in a feasibility study for safety and preliminary evidence for efficacy. That was a 2-year trial followed by the randomized controlled trial that led to our approval. That was a 2-year trial, and then patients had the opportunity to enter a long-term treatment trial, which the majority of patients, a significant majority of patients chose to do, to continue being treated for another 5 years. You add those up, and that is 9 years of prospective data in this patient population. This was the largest epilepsy trial in neuromodulation ever done, and it's getting even larger because of an FDA requested and therefore performed post-approval study that began shortly after our approval. First patient implanted in 2014. 324 patients at 32 centers across the United States, followed for 5 years. We will present today the primary effectiveness endpoint, which is at the 3-year time point. So how well does this work? Well, imagine we have a therapy, a powerful technology, unlike anything that's ever been used before. And so we had to look at each other and say, where do we start? So we selected a starting point, and we selected correctly because we found in these patients with really intractable epilepsy that there was a substantial response. It exceeds that of anti-seizure medications, 44% reduction in seizures. And look at that climb. It almost looks like Joel's figure about NeuroPace up and to the right. We saw an increasing improvement over time with patients having a 75% reduction at the time the trial ended. So what is going on? Well, we got 28% of patients seizure-free for a period of 6 months or more, and these were patients with close to 20-year history of intractable epilepsy. But what happened during this time is us learning, and it also, what was going on is a unique property of neuromodulation, which is that people get better with time. So let's talk about a more contemporary experience. A group of investigators, including Dr. Rao, who is the principal author of this manuscript, combined 150 patients to say, well, how well is this working in the real world? And the answer is, wow, it's working much better. So we were getting outcomes similar to what we got at 5 years in our clinical trial. And by 3 years, we were getting outcomes that exceeded that we saw in the initial clinical trial. And we found that that the median seizure reduction was 82% within 3 years, and 1 in 3 patients had a 90% or more reduction. So what do we see here? Better, faster. And we'll talk about why that might be, but the learning curve, I would attribute a lot of it to us understanding what's going on, and much of that was contributed, of course, by the empirical experience in the clinical trials, but much of that is a result of the data. Now, a therapy is not really helpful unless it is meaningful in a patient's life. And of course, seizures are a big part of that, but quality of life, function, well-being are critically important, are as important. And as part of the studies that we did very rigorous assessments of quality of life, of mood, and of cognitive function. And we found that there were improvements in overall quality of life. And you need to have that if you have a meaningful therapy. But really, we were somewhat surprised to see that there were improvements in areas that are often really problems for people with epilepsy. And that includes subjective improvements in cognition and in mental health. And depression is a comorbid condition with epilepsy. So let's look at the quantitative outcomes obtained by neuropsychological or neurocognitive testing. We found that there were no negative mood or cognitive effects. In fact, there were improvements in those areas, particularly in areas that are often challenged in intractable epilepsy, and that includes verbal fluency and aspects of memory. So we have a therapy that works and that brings meaningful benefit to patients.